Hi, I'm Bob N6TV. This talk is quite a bit like the one that I did have posted on YouTube. First, I want to thank Scott, K0MD, for organizing this meeting today, and also Paul, KB9AVO, for bringing the antenna and his K4 and power supply so I could do a little demo after the talk if we can get the HDMI to work, and we think we can. So you can hear me okay, everybody? All right, good. So this is an updated version of the tips talk that is on my QRZ.com page. I'll update it there after the show. So some of this you may have already seen, so I'm going to go through it quickly. I may skip some slides to leave more time at the end to show you live stuff that isn't covered in the talk and anything you may have a question about. But if you do have a question, there's a mic up here. You could come up and ask it, and I don't mind short interruptions. So the first thing is I'd like you all to please, these are the updated links. Everyone should gets a hard copy of the Introduction to K4 manual. And if you click on that link in the PDF that'll be on my website, you can download the introduction and search it. The RIT setup guide I authored. It's a little out of date. It still talks about you have to use 915 hertz FSK tone, but you can use any tone you like now. And I'll update it one of these days. Of course, the built-in manual is not only in the radio, but it's on the web, and you might find it much easier to read and search using your ordinary web browser rather than the part built into the radio. And if you want to write macros, there's the link to the programmer's reference. Anybody here in this meeting has not signed up for the Elecraft groups.io discussion group? Everyone here is already on the discussion group. That's great. There is a files area. It's a little hard to find in the UI, but just add files to the end of the URL like you see here. And you can see a list of the files that include the new owner setup checklist and the FT8 guide that's written by WT8P. If you're looking for info on how to set up FT8 today, I'm not going to cover that. It's really pretty well set up by his guide, but maybe I'll have time later to answer questions. This isn't my laptop, so I don't know if FT8's installed on it. So number one tip is to use the norm switch. So you get the radio from the factory. You're going to find that you go to a certain mode for the first time, like AM or FM, and can't hear anything. The bandwidth's too narrow, too wide. It's not set up right. Just hold down that button that's labeled filter, and you see in yellow it's labeled norm. That normalizes the passband and cleans it up, and then it's working correct for that mode. And the radio will remember that bandwidth and shift as shown on the display here, but only on that VFO on that band. So if you hit swap VFO button, now it's going to change your bandwidth and shift. Hit norm again, go to the next band, hit norm again, do it for all your modes, both VFOs, and then your bandwidths will be set fine for each. So if everything doesn't sound right and the filters aren't centered, hold down that norm switch. That's my number one tip. You probably already discovered that there's a menu setting for you can turn the speakers plus phones on. If you have a stereo plug, doesn't have to be stereo speakers, but if you have a stereo plug in the rear panel speaker jack, set speakers to 2, and that way you'll hear true stereo in the headphones. The default from the factory might be 1, so if anything's plugged into an external speaker and you try to turn on speakers plus phones, you're only going to hear mono. You're not going to hear any diversity. You're not going to hear the two radios in one in each ear. So be sure to set speakers to 2. I want you to search the effing manual, please. When you can't find something, there's a search icon. It's shown right there, question mark in the lower right corner of the display is always the thing that brings up the help text. And then you can hit that search icon. Looks like a magnifying glass. And the next thing that pops up is an on-screen keyboard. By the way, if you have a USB keyboard plugged into your K4, as soon as you see this on-screen keyboard, you can start typing on your physical USB keyboard. Backspace key works. It's much easier than trying to touch the buttons on the screen. So if you're going to do a lot of searching in the manual or a lot of entry of macros or CW messages, temporarily connect the USB keyboard to your K4, then you can just type away without having to use this rather cumbersome on-screen keyboard. Type in the thing you're looking for in the manual. In this case, I want to know what's this IIR stuff all about. And then you hit enter, and then it jumps hopefully to the first hit for IIR in the manual. It highlights the rest, and when you click that little greater than arrow, it jumps to the next hit. Now this magic button here, which a lot of people haven't discovered, will enable the help text to fill the screen, which makes it somewhat easier to read. And you can scroll the screen when simply, if you've already touched a knob or something and you're not sure what you just did, hit the question mark and then tap last control, and it'll jump, hopefully, to that part in the manual that talks about that control that you're just trying to manipulate. And you won't have to search the whole manual for it. That's a handy button to learn to use, but it doesn't do it automatically. You have to hit question mark to go to help, and then tap last control, and it'll try to figure out the last thing you were trying to do. So tip number 4, and I may do this as a live demo here later, as shipped from the factory, you might find the waterfall display is full of noise and not really showing clean lines and clean traces of weak signals, which is the whole purpose of the waterfall. So the first thing I recommend you do is change the scale, which is the vertical axis height in dB. It comes at the factory about 20, which doesn't cover in FS units. So I would change it to 80, and then I think you'll find it works most better. Your S9 signals show up and your S0 signals show up. And my favorite is to use fixed 2 mode. I'll show how that works. It basically scrolls a half a screen at a time when you get to the edge. You want the cursor to move. You don't want the whole waterfall to smear, which may be the factory default. I'm not a fan of tracking mode or center, where the VFO frequency is always in the center, because you see a signal and everything sort of slides in the wrong direction. With fixed 2 mode, the cursor is moving and not the whole screen. And the span is remembered, that's the width of the span of the display. It's remembered, it can be set per mode, and so that when you use your quick memories to save and restore them, it restores the span. I'm going to go through that in a second. And if you just want to slide the bottom edge of the display around, you can use the RIT knob to do that. It's equivalent to maybe if you've played with other SDRs, where you can kind of grab the bottom edge of the screen and slide the edges of the band, because by default, the radio is going to show you a lot of out-of-band signals that really have no interest. And that's, you can use the RIT knob as a control for that. And remember that if you tap A to B twice, you kind of double tap it, then it copies everything from radio A to radio B. You just single tap, it copies the frequency only. And you double tap, it copies the mode, the filters, the bandwidth, and so on. So that's why it's important to learn how to double tap. So let's go through some of these. Where's the scale setting? You tap display, and then you tap hold down the scale button, because in yellow means hold down and gray means tap. And then whenever you see that symbol on the right-hand side there with the A and the circle, some people call it a letter Q, that means rotate the VFO knob to manipulate whatever's on the screen. In this case, since scale is displayed, when you rotate that knob, the scale can be increased. You don't have to tap the plus and minus buttons, but you can certainly tap or click those with the mouse if you want to, but I find it easier just to turn the knob. And then also on the display menu, this button is a little obscure because it just says one thing, fixed 2 right now, but every time you tap it, it cycles through the other values you need, such as tracking mode or fixed 1, which is a whole screen scrolling. And they're all documented in the manual. If you tap that, hit last control, you'll go to the section that explains what each of the different modes is. And if your cursor disappears on the right, you see cursor A+, cursor B+. That means both cursors for VFO A and B are turned on. And if they ever go away and you lost your cursor, just tap those buttons and it'll come back. Remember, yellow for hold and gray for just tap. So once you rotate the VFO knob, when you have span displayed, then it adjusts the span. In this case, I'm using like a 250 kilohertz span. I believe the max is around 350 or 368. And then if you go into the menu, and I like this feature a lot, there's other alternatives. By default, this is turned off. So, you go to the menu and you rotate the VFOA knob until you get down to the RIT section. All of the entries in the menu are in alphabetical order. You tap that unlock icon, and then you rotate the VFOA knob, or you can use the up and down arrows once it's unlocked to set it to pan center. That means when the RIT is turned off, the RIT knob is going to help you center your display. Yes, sir? If anybody is here for Parks on the Air, that is in room 1. It should be obvious this is not Parks on the Air. Okay, so there's your RIT knob on the display on the silk screen. It says OFS for offset, but they decided to call it RIT in the menu. Sometimes the UI changes after the silk screen is painted. Tip number 5, once you get your scope edges and your filters all normalized for both VFOs, and remember, set the scope edges on both VFOs by hitting that A to B button twice. Now it's time to save all those settings for that band in the per band quick memories. These are the most useful buttons on the radio, in my opinion, and other radios don't have it. You hit the store button and then tap M1 for, I like to use it, you see at the bottom, I like to use M1 for CW and M2 for sideband, M3 for RIT, and M4 for the FT8 frequency. Each one of those will have a different span stored, different filters, set both VFOs so I can swap the AB button anytime I want and not see all the edges move. And I highly recommend that you use them. They're per band, so you get 4 memories per band. So you go to all the bands, set your scope, set your mode, set your filters, do everything normal the way you like it, store it, and then take a backup so you can always get all that stuff back. It's the most useful buttons on the radio. I never use the mode button. I use the band button to change to a band, or maybe my software to change a band. And then I just recall M1 or recall M2 if I want to go to sideband. It puts the scope edges at the edge of the sideband frequencies, and I'm not seeing any out-of-band stuff. Again, that works best with the fixed 2 instead of any kind of tracking or slide mode. A lot of folks get their new K4 and they don't quite set up the antenna dialog right. It confuses some people. But the first thing you want to do is indicate which of your ports have a transmit antenna on them. On the TX antenna jacks, there's only 3. By default, all are selected, and you don't need to select all if you only got 1 or 2 antennas, or maybe just 1 for an amplifier is connected. So just check the 2 boxes or the boxes that have an antenna connected, and leave the rest unchecked. And that circular icon in the lower right side, is the dismiss button. That means close the menu. So you tap TX, and then you tap antenna config, and it tells you this is the antenna switch, and then you uncheck all, and you tap the boxes you want. Now, before you go further, you may want to rename your antennas so it doesn't show up as antenna 1. Maybe you got a dummy load on antenna 2. How do you rename them? That's a little tricky to get to, and the first time you get the radio, though, you tap the receive antenna button there that I've highlighted with the yellow arrow on the left. And the first time, handing out of the factory, that brings up this dialog. This is the only place you can use in the radio to rename your antennas, and it lets you rename all of them. And the way you rename it is you just hold down the button, and then you get a pop-up keyboard. Again, you can type on your USB keyboard if you have one connected, and tap the Enter key. Don't hit the X at the upper right corner. That cancels the whole update. The backspace key is next to the Enter if you need the backspace. And then it saves the name. Now, once you've got your antennas named, then the only way to display that is, show later is you have to have display all checked to even see that dialog. But once you got all your antennas set, go ahead and select main RX, antenna config, and then tap the use subset button. That way, instead of bringing up a menu every time you hit receive antenna, it just cycles through every antenna you've checked with a checkbox. In this case, I have 1 transmit antenna on antenna 1, and that's the only one I want to be able to receive on. So therefore, I'm going to check equal TX antenna, which means whatever my transmit antenna is, I'm going to receive on that. And I also have 2 receive-only antennas connected to the receive antenna 1 and 2 jacks, so I check those 2 boxes. Why didn't I check antenna 1 here? Well, that would be redundant. Since I only have a TX antenna 1, 2, 3, and there's no reason to check antenna 1 here. There's a few cases you might want to do it. But in this case, if I checked antenna 1, every time I tap receive antenna, it's going to cycle through every one of those check boxes. It's going to go from equal TX ant, and then the next time I tap it, it's going to go to ant 1, which is the same thing. So you're going to think it's not working because I tapped it twice and it stayed on ant 1. Well, that's why. You only need to check the equal TX antenna usually in most cases, and don't have to bother for the receivers to check ant 1, 2, 3. Just indicate if you have a receive antenna and equal TX ant. The equal opposite TX ant is not implemented yet. It'll be very useful if you have an antenna that can transmit and receive, like antenna 1 and antenna 2, like a 100-watt station with 2 antennas. Be useful for that. But you can simulate that function with macros, which I don't cover here. Once you set the antennas for the main receiver, you got to do the same thing for the subreceiver, because otherwise they won't work consistently. So once again, you check use subset, and you tap the 3 check boxes the same as the main. There's no way to copy from one to the other. You got to do it manually. Tap sub RX antenna and then ent config, and then it brings up the sub antenna configuration menu. I went a little too fast there. You notice in the upper left corner it says sub ent. It always tells you what the display is referring to. And then once you are there, when you tap RX ent, it'll cycle through everything that's checked. But if you hold down that button, it changes the sub-receiver antennas through every one that you've checked in the sub-receiver antenna dialog. And again, if you need to go back and rename an antenna, well, you can't get there from here. You have to go and tap TX, main RX ent config and go back and temporarily check display all, then close the menu, hit the receive antenna button, then it comes up with the dialog when you tap it of renaming antennas. And once you get them renamed right, go back and check lose subset, so the RX antenna button just cycles through without showing you a distracting display. So the antennas you're using are always displayed on the radio, and the left-hand side is in white is where it's showing you your main receiver antenna, and this happens even if you have only one pan adapter showing, because you don't need to have 2 pan adapters showing to use the sub-receiver. The middle always shows your TX antenna in orange, and the right-hand side is your sub-receiver's antenna. And so every time you tap those buttons, watch those displays to see what's changing. If you have a mouse, you can actually touch those parts of the screen with the mouse. It's a little small to touch with your finger, and you can cycle through antennas that way too. So the display menu is a little hard for some people to understand. How many people have hooked up an external monitor to their K4? About half the guys. So you can use the external monitor in 2 ways, as it just a pan adapter only with frequency, or you can have it mirror the main display, and you can slide the mouse back and forth between the two. These buttons here in the upper left, let's see if I get this laser pointer to work. Nope, laser pointer, there we go. So these buttons here are indicating what you are doing with the monitors. You can highlight one, or you can highlight both by hitting this ampersand. And this button over here decides what you're doing with the 2 pan adapters, A and B. Some of these settings apply to the pan adapter, some applies to the monitor. Like waterfall height, you could want the height to be maybe the same on both LCD and the external. You highlight this, you hold down waterfall height, or waterfall there, and then you can make 50% waterfall height, for example, on both monitors so they're consistent. Or maybe you want more waterfall in the external monitor, so you just highlight external monitor and set the waterfall height. But maybe you want the span to be different for VFO as A and B, or you want it to be the same, so you just tap the letter A and then you adjust the span for pan adapter A or main receiver, or you want to adjust the span to be both the same. So that's what those buttons do. It's a little confusing at first, but it does make sense. First, you're selecting which monitor you want it to apply to, both or just one, and then you select which receivers you want it to apply to, both with the ampersand or just one. No laser pointer. Okay. So let's have some new stuff here after this slide. So we'll show you what's new. Got a request. But in the meantime, as it comes from the factory of your CW, how many guys are CW ops like me here? Oh, good. CW ops love the Elecraft stuff. The pitch to control as shipped from the factory, and by the way, this is an old graphic. I think it's PTCH now on the display, not PTC. It comes at 600 hertz audio tone, which is pretty high. It makes the passband sound a little harsh to my ears because the passband's always centered on the pitch, although the pitch can be adjusted in 10 hertz steps and the passband jumps in 50 hertz steps. And you'll notice a step function as you start changing the pitch knob. But if you tap pitch at the top, and when you see the yellow at the bottom, that means it's not the control that the knob is changing. You have to tap that WPM to switch it right here. You have to switch it to pitch at the top, then you rotate the knob and adjust the pitch. Set it to 500 hertz or 470 is the one I've settled on as being the most pleasing sound. And then your passband will sound nicer and your pitch will be nicer. And as shipped from the factory, the paddles and you're using the internal keyer doesn't affect external keying. The weight is a bit heavy. The dots and dashes are a little too long compared to the spaces between them. That was once needed correction. I would change it to 1.0 now if you have R30 or later, which most of us should have by now. And there's this new menu option since this was first put together, which allows you to enable sharper filters when the bandwidth is set to below 200 hertz. So you jump to that menu item and you can turn on that menu setting to enable the sharper CW filters. And it kind of natural, as soon as you crank the width down to 200 hertz or less, it's going to enable those. And you can hear the difference when there's signals nearby between the sharp skirts and the original ones. This is a brand new slide. Somebody was asking for how do I copy, what's the best tip for copying weak signals? Well, on CW, I found that the audio peaking filter really helps a lot. It does need some fine tuning. You got to be exactly 0 beat, which you can do with the spot button. But if you tap main RX and then you set the APF bandwidth to 50 hertz, because the default is 30, which is really too narrow in my opinion. Here's the main RX button and here's the APF BW button. Nothing in yellow because it doesn't have a hold function. You just tap that and it cycles between 50 hertz and 30 hertz. And I recommend you do that on all bands and both VFOs because it's right now remembered per band, per VFO, instead of being a global setting. And once you do that, take a backup so you can get back to it. Unfortunately, I've set all mine to 50 hertz, and after either a software update or a restart of the radio, it comes back to 30. Sometimes, not always. So you may have to do this multiple times. And then the trick to activate it quickly, I've already covered, you tap main RX and tap APF bandwidth. And then you can, is that normally to invoke the APF, you have to hold down this filter button to get the APF to come on. That's too slow. When a weak one's calling you, you want to hear it right away. So I program a macro that does this AP slash and AP $ command that turns on the audio peaking filter for both the main and the sub instantly. And if you hap it again, then it turns off instantly. You don't have to hold down that APF button. So I really like using the AP macro. So that is a really handy function. It should be on a single tap, but the radio doesn't have that built in. Program it on a K-Pod button. K-Pod. This is Paul's K-Pod. Thank you again, Paul. Put it on a K-Pod button and single tap, instant on or off. I really like that feature. How many here, I think I'm going to skip this one over to save some time because you've already known by now, I hope, that you always want to change your FTDI default options to turn off serial enumeration and turn on disable modem control at startup. If you plug in your USB or turn on your computer or reboot your computer and you hear coming out of the radio, that's because you forgot to change these options back. Sometimes the Windows 11 update will wipe these out and send them back to the factory defaults. And of course, that only applies if you've enabled CW and PTT keying on your menu, which is a real handy feature to do. How many here are using N1MM contest software? Okay, so that software has built in the feature to key CW and PTT on the rig control port, so you don't need a Win key. You can just use it over the serial cable. You just enable CW and PTT keying in the menu, as I've shown in those slides, and I think you'll find that it works quite well. You do need to turn your CPU to maximum performance so there's no timing issues, and I think you'll find it sends great CW, and you can just use the paddles and the radio for hand sending. So here's tip number 11, which is that some people don't realize that the remote antenna function, which is a hold of the antenna knob, is also a fifth function key for programming a macro. So I wanted to use that to automatically adjust the reference level in my display. Anybody have a P3 before they had the K4? Quite a few. Remember, you change bands and the reference level, you had to go in and adjust it because the waterfall was a mess. Well, the K4 has this automatic reference feature. I think most radios don't have this. I don't think ICOM radios have this, where it will automatically figure out the right reference level based on the average band noise. But once in a while, it gets fooled by a loud signal on the band, and you want it to reset. So there's a macro for that. So how do we program a macro? Well, first thing you do is you type function, and then you hold down the macros button. And you get a display that looks like this. And when you rotate the VFOA knob, then you can scroll up and down the display. The soft function keys, FN.1 through 8, F1 through F8, are on the display. I don't really like tapping the display so much to run something. It's too many buttons. So I prefer using a single hold or tap of a K-Pod button. And so how do I program that remote antenna button to do what I want when I hold it down to automatically reset the display? Well, there's two places to enter things, and people get really confused about this the first time they enter a macro. The common mistake is they try to enter the macro text here in this column. That doesn't work. That column is for labeling what the function is in English. It'll be displayed on function keys, and it's just your reference information on other keys. So you tap there, and you're going to get a pop-up keyboard, and you can type what the function does. In this case, I'm saying it's going to automatically adjust the reference level. But once you do that and hit enter to save it, now you want to tap on this part of the display, the third column as I call it, and this is where you program your macro strings. You don't have to put in a label, but I recommend you do. It makes it easier to see that you've got stuff in the right column. By the way, don't tap too long a label, because then it tends to cover up where you enter the macro text, and that will not be so good because you won't be able to figure out what's going on. So don't enter too much text in the label column, but enter something. And then again, you enter the pound sign AR1. It doesn't have to be uppercase, but you should put the semicolon. And you don't need just one command. You can have a whole series of commands. Don't put any spaces between them. No spaces, no blanks. You can use lowercase. Make sure you're using a semicolon and not the colon. And again, plug in your USB keyboard. It'll be easier to type these things. No, right now there's no load utility for these. The best you could do is edit the backup file that gets created when you say save all the macros. You can tap enter to save, and you're done. Now here's it's a new slide. This is how I programmed all of the function keys on my K-Pod. It was very hard to get this screenshot. I had to glue a bunch of pieces together, and I left out, when I was doing that, the K3 tap button, which is why it's there at the bottom. So function key 1 I programmed as my diversity toggle. It actually works better than the diversity button on the radio. If you hold down diversity on the radio, okay, it turns on diversity. You're listening to both receivers, locked to the same frequency, even though VFOB shows a different frequency. Ignore VFOB when that diversity LED is on. But what DV backslash, not forward slash, but DV backslash does is it toggles diversity completely on or completely off. If you hold down diversity on the radio, it turns on diversity. If you hold it down again, it turns off diversity and leaves the sub receiver on. Now your radio B is listening to VFOB on a totally different frequency, and you're all messed up. Chances are, when you want to toggle diversity on, it's to hear a weak one. So you just want to tap it on and off. And you notice I programmed it into both K-PON function key 1 tap and hold. That way, if I hold the button down a little too long, it still does what I wanted. If it's available to me for another function if I want to, but for a function like that, I may hold it down too long and get something else, and I don't want that. So I programmed those two buttons the same, so whether I tap or hold it, it gets the same thing. Function key 2, I've got as a band stack button on tap. You know, the band stack is 3 different VFOs and modes that are automatically saved by the band button. So if you tap the band 20, okay, you're on 20 meters now. Tap band 20 again, even though you're already on 20 meters, it's going to go to the next set of frequencies in the band stack. Tap band 20 a third time, it's going to go to the third set of frequencies in the band stack. Tap it a fourth time, and you're back to where you started. It's a little hard to hit, the band button on the radio and then the band so many times. If you just do BN greater than, that's like walking through the band stack, put it on a single tap, and you can see the 3 frequencies you've saved. It's very handy if in a contest you're running up and down S&P, didn't get through to that guy, save that in the band stack, move to the next guy, and tap and go on. I really do a lot of screen captures to explain stuff to people, so I'm always using the SS0 command to capture the LCD screen to a bitmap. It puts it on the USB stick. SS1 command if I wanted to capture what's on the external LCD. That's a hold on F3. And out of order here, I've got the 3 of tap to just turn diversity and subreceiver off with a single tap, kind of undoing what the diversity button does. And I told you about the APF toggle before, so I can quickly toggle the APF on and off. The AP/ command, I put that in the lower left corner of the K-Pod where it's real easy for a right-handed guy like me to reach with my left hand, and that turns on the APF real quick. And if I want to toggle a subreceiver on and off, I just hold down F4. This function A to B is just a quick way of copying frequencies. A, B, all is like a double tap of the A to B button. Here's a function that isn't on the radio at all, which it almost belongs, but it isn't. 6 tap is doing AB2. AB2 just swaps the frequencies. It doesn't change the mode or anything else. It just swaps the frequencies, doesn't mess with the display. If you tap AB on the radio, it does the equivalent of what I've got on the hold key, which is swap everything except antennas. It swaps preamp, attenuator, band edges, all this, the mode maybe. Normally the AB button on the radio doesn't do what you want, so make a K-Pod button do it. And then these last 2 have to deal with the RIT. I'm often using RIT off for phone and maybe on for CW. And I have a way of turning it on and clearing it with 2 commands. This is an example of putting 2 commands together with a semicolon in between. Okay, just a couple more tips and then we'll have hopefully a live demo. If I can get the HDMI to work. If you have an amplifier, an Elecraft amplifier, even if it's a non-Elecraft amplifier, you want to enable this per band power option in the menu. The default is no. This allows the radio to automatically switch to the last power level you used on that band. Using any solid state drive from Elecraft or otherwise, you probably need 10 watts on one band and 20 watts to drive it to full power on the other band. The radio remembers that, but only if you turn on this option to do it. And then it will then remember your last power setting on that band. And if you have an Elecraft amp hooked up with a proper aux cable, it will remember that setting and it'll automatically detect when the amp goes into operate mode, switch to the second power saving for that band. And if you turn off operate mode, go to standby or turn the amp off, it goes back to your barefoot power level setting on that band. So for Elecraft amps, it remembers 2 levels per band. Doesn't work with non-Elecraft amps, but it does remember the last drive level that you've used. So set that to yes. An update for this is there's some new settings in the menu. The old one up there at the top, TX delay key out to RF out. That's the delay between the time that it keys the amplifier and the RF comes out. And right now, the issue is that it's about 3 milliseconds slower than what it says on the display. So if you set it to 5 millisecond delay, you're actually getting about 8. Set it to what you think your amplifier needs. If it's a relay, it might need 10 to 12 milliseconds of delay between the time that RF comes, the amplifier's keyed and the time that RF comes out. So that's an old setting, and it's worth checking what your amplifier requirement is from the manufacturer. You can get away with 5 milliseconds easily on the Elecraft amps because they're solid state pin diodes, but a relay type amp like an ACOM or an SPE probably want to increase that number. Factory default's 8 and you're really getting about 11. Now this setting at the bottom is brand new, unkey to receive. And if you hear, this is the thing that NG7M fixed or bugged them about so long, they finally got around to fixing it, which is when you have an amplifier connected, and so it's being keyed and it's in operate mode, as soon as you go back to receive mode, you'll hear a big pop in the receiver. And that means you haven't added enough delay to mute the receiver a little longer, because most amplifiers these days, as a safety for rigs like the 7300 that have an RF tail, they hold their relay closed longer than you wanted it to. So you've unkeyed the amplifier, but the amp has stayed keyed just for a little longer, just in case there's any RF tail and you don't trust the transceiver. So and even the 1500 does this. It holds its relay, its pin diode, closed for about another 5 or 6 milliseconds after you've said, I'm done transmitting. And then it opens that line. That causes a big transition spike in the receiver from no signals to a whole bunch of signals. And that's what causes the pop for about 1 or 2 milliseconds. So if you're hearing that and it's bugging you, go into the menu, change this new value, unkey to receive, which means mute the receiver an additional, let's say in this case, 6 milliseconds after you stop keying before the receiver is actually going to receive. And so That's going to eliminate the pop and make it much more pleasant to operate the radio, especially in QSK mode. But even non-QSK or phone, if you don't like that pop and you're using an external amplifier, use that new menu setting. Last tip of the day, and then we'll go to questions and maybe a live demo, is how to set my radio for the best punch on single sideband. You got, how many of you here are mostly sideband and not CW? Oh, we got a few. But the CW guys need help on phone too, because they rarely use it. So you tap TX and TX EQ. By the way, this TX Cal menu, you may not see that on your radio. That's something they enabled in field test radios. It's, I think, a built-in calibration program, sort of like my K4 Cal program. But I don't think it's enabled in any radios yet, except the field test ones. I haven't tested it yet. Anyway, tap TX EQ, and you get this sliders that come up. And this is my recommended starting point if you have a flat microphone, not a Heil HC4 that has its own EQ built in. But if you have a mic like a CM500 or any Electret mic that works on a PC, chances are that's got a very flat response. It's not optimal for maximum punch when you're DXing or contesting. It might be good for rag chewing and ESSB mode where you have a lot of bass or something. But if you don't want a lot of bass and you're trying to get through a pileup, you can just send that command I've listed on the screen there, and that, or put it in a macro, and that will instantly set all these sliders, or you can move the buttons around, or even drag it with the mouse if you like. But one tip for you is that this flat button over here on the right, that is really useful for hearing the difference. And the way you hear the difference is you play a voice memory back. You record something. Don't try to speak and listen because you're hearing your own voice in your head and it doesn't sound quite the same. Turn up the monitor so you can hear what it sounds like. Play back one of your recorded messages, and you can do it while this screen is up. And then tap flat, and it'll reset everything to flat response. Play the same message again, and you'll be able to hear the difference in the monitor. If it sounds better, you tap flat again, and it recycles between the flat and the new equalizer settings. People are afraid to tap flat. Oh, I got to start all over again. No, just every time you tap it, it toggles back and forth between flat and your last setting. So that's a handy tip to hear the difference. And I've listened in a second receiver. I've also listened in the monitor. Sometimes it doesn't sound the same to me. They sound the same, especially if you're not talking, but if you're hitting the memory play buttons. So how do we record a voice key or message? Somebody was asking for tips on this. You don't have to tap the screen. You can if you like, but I prefer to use buttons because that way you have less delay at the beginning and end. See, how much time we have, Scott? 10 minutes? Oh dear, I went too long. Anyway, to record a message, tap record M1, just tap the keys on the radio, then you talk your message as soon as you tap M1 so there's no gaps. And as soon as you're finished talking, you tap M1 to save it, or you hit the record button again to cancel your recording and leave the one that was there. And you can use these playback messages to get to all four messages in both banks, PB1 through PB8. And otherwise, you would only have four messages if you try to simulate pressing the function keys. All right, to summarize, that's all of the tips that I went over today. While we're trying to get the HDMI up to display. Yes?
We have a portable mic here for questions.
Yes, let's hear.
Raise your hand and I'll bring it to you.
And if any question in the room.
No questions, wow. Okay.
Here's the, if you're not on the Group I/O page, you can go to this page to search for questions. Tara, too, go ahead.
As a somewhat newbie, is this display on your website? I mean, this...
The older version of this talk is on my QRZ.com page.
Yes.
And after I get home from the show, or maybe later tonight or tomorrow, I'll upload the new version. It'll be at the top of the list under my presentations. No video or audio. Maybe I'll give it again and somebody will record it again and it'll be on YouTube later for the words that I use, but the slides will be there.
Any other questions?